Welcome to the National Drug Screening Video Series. Today we're going to talk about commonly asked questions about reasonable suspicion drug testing that employers might have. So tune in today. You're going to get some great insights on what is reasonable suspicion and how it affects you. Thank you for joining us today. Mr. Joe Reilly, President of National Drug Screening. He's taken time out of his schedule and training schedule to share some insights with us and answer some of the common employer questions we have out there. A lot of employers are asking questions about reasonable suspicion. There's a lot of variables that go along with that. Mr. Reilly's been in the drug testing industry since 1993, has done training for governmental agencies, large companies, and organizations all across the U.S. And I appreciate you joining us to share your insights today, Joe.
Absolutely. Good to be here and happy to share information and answer your questions about reasonable suspicion in the workplace, reasonable suspicion drug and alcohol testing, and supervisor training.
Yeah, those are all three things that are extremely important, especially in today's workforce with all the things that are going on. So I'm going to start off with one of the big questions that we get is who at a company can actually require a reasonable suspicion drug test?
Okay, so the best person to make a determination that someone might be under the influence or impaired from drugs or alcohol would be a supervisor who's been trained to do such a thing, who's been trained to make reasonable suspicion determinations based on a person's appearance, behavior, smell, and they have something more than a hunch that this person could be impaired or under the influence of drugs or alcohol. A trained supervisor should be the person who does that.
Yeah, so when that trained supervisor is making that determination, what do they need to know about what reasonable suspicion is? Is it something about immediate impairment? Could it be something long-term? You mentioned about appearance, behavior, speech, those kind of things. Can you go and tell us a little bit about what reasonable suspicion is, and then maybe we can talk about how training can be acquired to make those determinations?
Yeah, we actually kind of break down reasonable suspicion situations into two different types, okay? And the first type is actually what's required by United States Department of Transportation regulated employers. And what that is there's reasonable suspicion, there's some signs and symptoms that the supervisor can document, that they can articulate, that are contemporaneous. Signs and symptoms that this person could possibly, not definitively, could possibly be under the influence of illicit drugs or alcohol, and there's a safety issue. And so based on that documentation of what they can document, and a form can be provided to help them along. What are they observing? Does the person have slurred speech? Are they staggering? Do they smell like marijuana? Do they smell like alcohol? Are they getting belligerent? What are those very specific things? Not third-party accusations.
Right.
Very specific things that a supervisor is seeing, hearing, or smelling.
And so for those kind of things, it can't be the subjective, like you mentioned, somebody just saying they saw something in the parking lot. They actually need to have that skill set. I think that's a lot of things missing from employers. So where can somebody get that type of training so that they're better equipped to make those kind of decisions?
Yeah, and you made a great point about the skill set, because without the supervisor training, not many supervisors are ever going to make a determination that they think somebody's impaired unless it is totally, totally obvious. But your question is, where do they get this supervisor training? So there's various ways that they can get it. Drug testing vendors like National Drug Screening, we deliver supervisor training in several different ways. Okay, one is we have a quarterly webinar that people can register for, and it's a live webinar that I conduct or that you conduct. And it's typically a 2-hour webinar. Reasonable suspicion training by DOT definition needs to be 2 hours, okay? So a quarterly webinar. We can do a custom webinar for a company. We do those all the time. A company's got 16 supervisors all over the country. We do a custom webinar, okay? We can also record a training that a custom training that could be branded for the company and can include some specifics about their own policies that they can then upload into their learning management system. Working on 3 of those right now for larger companies that want to put that training that we customize for them, and they pay us one time and they get this training and they can use it over and over and over again, okay? We also have online computer-based on-demand remote training. So a company has one supervisor, they can buy a license and the supervisor can view the training. They get a certificate automatically. It's all self-service. They have 100 supervisors. They can buy 100 licenses. So it's all self-service, on-demand, computer-based remote training, which a lot of trainings today are. And so it's this easy way to deliver that supervisor training. In addition, there's lots of ways we can do it, okay?
Exactly.
We can go on site and do a presentation, okay? And we've done that many, many times, okay? So it may require driving somewhere, it may require flying somewhere, but if the company wants a live presentation, we can do that.
Yeah, and something you kind of mentioned that a lot of companies are looking to have their own training built in. That ties into some of our other videos, so make sure you check those out because that's being driven by some of the legislations. The impairment and determinations is becoming more and more of an issue with legalization or decriminalization of drugs out there. So make sure you definitely check out some of those videos and how that might apply to you.
Yeah, and one other quick thing, the signs and symptoms of marijuana use is becoming even more important in the supervisor training. We've actually beefed up our content to be able to explain more about what we kind of call, drug recognition. And we've worked with some law enforcement officers that were trained drug recognition officers to put together some additional content on recognizing signs and symptoms of being under the influence of marijuana.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that's important because you can't be aware of something until you're first aware of it. If you don't know what to look for, how can you identify it? So I think that's some great points. And one thing you touched on is reasonable suspicion supervisor training. Is it required, a best practice, or where does that fall in there? And I know you've worked as an expert witness in many legal cases for years where some of these types of things have kind of come into play. So is it really required, just a good idea, or is it something that you really, really ought to do? Otherwise, you're creating a great liability and risk for yourself.
Yeah, so in the DOT world, United States Department of Transportation, DOT regulated businesses, the transportation industries, it is absolutely required that they have supervisor training as part of their drug and alcohol testing program. There are approximately 16 states in the U.S. that have voluntary drug-free workplace programs that a business can volunteer to participate in. And by participating in that program, they may get an incentive like a workers' comp discount. But if they participate in the program, there are certain things that are now required, and reasonable suspicion supervisor training is one of those requirements. Other than that, it's kind of a best practice. You mentioned liability, and I've been on cases where, they did a reasonable suspicion test and they put the supervisor on the stand and they asked the supervisor, what are your qualifications to make this reasonable suspicion determination? What are your qualifications to tell me that this person is impaired or under the influence of drugs or alcohol? Well, the qualifications would be either that they took the supervisor training or didn't take the supervisor training. And if it's the latter, not going to go well with the jury.
Right. And the only other thing that they would have all that knowledge was if they were a drug user and they knew exactly what to look for, but that wouldn't go over really well for the jury either, would it?
Exactly. Now, going back to your original question, I mentioned that we break down reasonable suspicion for 2 different types. And the first one I mentioned was an immediate safety issue type, okay? There's another type which is not required under DOT, but it could be for non-DOT, it could be a DOT company, but you're doing it under your non-DOT policy, where there may be a pattern over time of productivity issues, behavioral issues. And so maybe you have a meeting with an employee and, here's some things we see going on. Is there some problem here? can we refer you to an employee assistance program? Is there something going on in your life that's causing this or that? And there could be. There very well could be. Lots of things go on in people's lives that could affect their productivity, could be mood swings or behavioral issues or being absent a lot, being late a lot. But if the supervisor, after documenting some of this pattern of behavior, is not coming up with any resolution as to why this is happening, we need improvement, Tom. Right. We need improvement in these 3 areas. And we're going to get back together in 10 days and we're going to revisit this. And let's say we get back together in 10 days and we revisit it and there's no improvement and there's no explanation. So at this point, I want to rule out that this is not a drug or alcohol problem, Tom. So I'm going to ask that you go for a reasonable suspicion drug and alcohol test to rule out that that's not the problem here.
Right.
It's not that I'm accusing you of being a drug or alcohol abuser or user. It's to rule out we got something going on here. We want to make sure it's not. It's kind of like in a murder investigation. They want to rule out the person who definitely didn't do it.
Yeah, and that's a great point. That just kind of triggered a question. So it's really not necessarily, you're not trying to, gotcha, get the person. You're trying to rule out drugs and alcohol as the cause so you can move on to something else.
Right.
And as you mentioned, even impairment, it may not be drugs and alcohol, and you've got to start somewhere to eliminate that. Can you expand on that just a little bit?
It could be a medical issue. It could be lots of different things, but we got to get improvement somehow, some way. And if the employee is not coming up with any reasons, and maybe they're being defensive, and there's no problem here. Well, there is a problem. You're absent 17 days in the last quarter. Okay. None of the employees want to talk to you anymore because you're belligerent.
Right.
Okay. You come in late on Friday mornings and you got the same clothes on you had on Thursday night. Okay. There's a problem here, Tom. We got to figure it out, and we're going to rule out that it's not drugs or alcohol. And if it is drugs or alcohol, we want to see if we can get you help. So it's not about gotcha. It's about what can we do to help you, to help the company. And if it is drugs or alcohol, we do have an ongoing safety issue, and we got to resolve that ongoing safety issue also.
Absolutely. I kind of want to go into depth on something that you had mentioned. You did mention a couple of examples of things. Can you tell us kind of a couple of more common examples of what would be actual reasonable suspicion, and then maybe touch on a couple that would not be actual reasonable suspicion from from a supervisor's standpoint?
Yeah, and so I've mentioned this in previous videos. My good friend Bill Judge, who's an attorney that's been involved in this stuff for 30 years, been working with him together. He does reasonable suspicion training, and I remember he said this 30 years ago at a training. He says, as a supervisor, if you got a little bit more than a hunch, you got reasonable suspicion, okay? Or if you're playing football and they catch the kickoff on the 0-yard line and they get past the 5-yard line, you got reasonable suspicion, okay? But it's something you can see, hear, smell. It's contemporaneous, it's specific, it's happening now. You smell marijuana, you see staggering, you see some bottle of booze falls out of the truck, different things like that. What's not reasonable suspicion is something that happened 3 days ago. Okay, so if you don't take action today, you don't get a second bite at the apple. What's not reasonable suspicion is Johnny says that Mary was smoking pot in the bathroom. That's not reasonable suspicion. Frequent trips to the restroom or frequent trips to the car might be an indicator to look further because there may be something going on here, but that's not specific reasonable suspicion. You don't have a suspicion of actual impairment, okay? Right. But talking to the person, looking at the person's eyes, okay? Having that confrontation, having that conversation, that's going to help you along also.
Yeah, so it's the supervisor actually doing those things. That's
not a coworker, it's the supervisor that's been trained.
Right, very, very important with that. One of the things that kind of stands out is, what if the supervisor was told or believes but doesn't see it? I know we've gotten this situation for National Drug Screening calls in, say, I need to do a random test because we think Bob's smoking pot on his break. Can they just call it a random test? And kind of what's the difference, and why would you not maybe want to go that direction?
Yeah, so I get that common question also. I've often got the question, hey, Joe, we want to do a random test on Bob because he's been acting funny lately. Well, what does funny mean?
Right.
Okay, is there some specific sign and symptom that you're looking at and you can document? And irregardless, if it's reasonable suspicion, you call it reasonable suspicion. Random is when a computerized, scientifically valid method selects somebody randomly. Bob acting funny, there's nothing random about it, is there? Nothing random about it. And you call it a random test, and let's say he tests positive, and you fire him, and he comes back and sues you for wrongful termination. His attorney is going to ask you, Mr. Supervisor, what was the scientifically valid random program that you used to do a random test on my client? And how are you going to answer that question if you called it a random?
That would be a challenge. And you've dealt with this in expert witness cases
We have.
many times.
Yeah.
That's pretty, and that's happened probably come up more often than it should, I would imagine.
It comes because, especially with untrained supervisors.
Right.
Okay, because we go over that whole conversation in training that you don't call it a random. But untrained supervisors, they don't want to get in a confrontation and say, I have reasonable suspicion and you need to go for a reasonable, we're just going to send you for a random test. Well, what scientifically valid method did you use to pick my client for a random test?
Yeah, can you kind of expand on that? You said somebody who's not trained. What are some of the downsides of somebody besides the legal issue? Just to kind of a couple of quick highlights. If somebody's not trained, why should they not make that determination, or why should they not be that? Or is there any circumstance? What should they do? Should they reach out to a supervisor who is trained to get their concurrence on that? Maybe they bring it to their attention. How should that work if you do have that situation come up? Besides just making sure that you get them trained going forward. Once you identify there's an issue.
So there's always the potential, if there's another supervisor, to ask for help. Can you observe Tom for a few minutes and tell me if you see what I'm seeing? Okay. So if there is another trained supervisor, hand it over to them. Let them go and observe, and maybe have the meeting together. If there's no trained supervisor, I think that the signs and symptoms have to be extremely obvious. Okay, to require a reasonable suspicion test and not have something come back to you from a legal point of view that you didn't really know what you were doing and my client wasn't impaired or my client was impaired, but you still had no right to do this reasonable suspicion test. So it's kind of a case-by-case basis. Obviously, the best scenario is to have a trained supervisor.
Right. Well, from an employer standpoint, what are some of the, obviously, a safety issue, immediate concern, performance, and those kind of things. But from an employer's perspective, overall, why is it important for them to do reasonable suspicion, testing it all, in addition to the training for that? But what are some of the other benefits of having that kind of program in place where your employees know that may be something that's going to happen?
Yeah, so just like random testing, reasonable suspicion testing, post-accident testing, they're all deterrents to folks starting to use drugs. Or maybe they used drugs when they were younger and now they're at a party and somebody's passing around a joint or they're lining up cocaine on the table. And so employees that work at companies that do drug testing, they might say, hopefully they will say, no, I can't do that. They drug test me at work. So you're avoiding even getting into that situation, okay? But the other big reason for reasonable suspicion testing, because if you suspect somebody of being impaired under the influence, illicit drugs, alcohol, you've got a safety issue on your hand. There is risk. There is something bad potentially about to happen. And by doing the reasonable suspicion testing, you're taking them out of service to get the test done, and they're not coming back until at least the next day or at least until you get the results of the test back.
Yeah, I think that's an important part of that. And I think employers, from the questions that we've gotten from them, I think sometimes there's a disconnect on, again, why they're doing certain things and how much it could really, affect them. So let me ask you this. You had talked about earlier about different ways that we can provide the training, how that can be done with on demand or in person. We can also create training for employers. Can employers have their own people do reasonable suspicion training as well? And do we have programs that would help them to do that? And would that make sense in certain circumstances?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of large employers do have, they have what's called a designated employer representative in the company, commonly referred to as a DER, as a DER. Like some of the major airlines, they have a whole team of people that run in-house the drug and alcohol testing program. And a lot of times they get trained up to provide in-house supervisor training. So if a company wants to do that, they don't know where to start, okay, they don't have somebody that's already trained to do that, we can give them a train-the-trainer program. We can give them the resources to learn to be a trainer for supervisor training. We can customize a program, give them an outline, give them PowerPoint slides, give them some video snippets, give them the forms that they should use for documentation. So we have a basically in a box train-the-trainer program for supervisor training.
Well, that's excellent. And make me just think of just one last question here before we wrap up. Is it one and done? Are there some times that it's required to do ongoing training? Should they do it? Should it be a best practice? Maybe you can speak to that for just a quick minute.
Yeah, absolutely. So by and large, the DOT regulations don't require repetitive ongoing training every year, every 2 years, every 5 years, or whatever. Okay. The FAA program in their regulation does say recurrent training is required, but they don't say what the frequency should be. Okay. The industry standard has kind of evolved to say about every 2 to 3 years, the supervisor should be retrained. Things change, drugs change, the potency of drugs change, the trends change. There may be new ideas, new, better techniques to recognize signs and symptoms. Right. So about every 2 to 3 years is what we would recommend as a best practice. Obviously, if there's a court case and because there's a challenge because something went bad in this reasonable suspicion drug test and they got the supervisor on the stand, have you had reasonable suspicion supervisor training? Yes, sir, I have. Oh, do you have a certificate that shows you had that? Yes, sir, I have a certificate. Oh, interesting that this certificate is dated January 15th, 1984.
All right.
Are you sure you remember everything about that, Tom?
And nothing's changed since then, right? Absolutely.
So we say every couple of years.
Outstanding. And I know there's probably a few state regulations and state voluntary programs that we've maybe talked to.
Actually, some of them do have some specific recurrent training. So in anything to do with drug testing, non-DOT, you got to look at your state laws.
Absolutely. Joe, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. Really appreciate all the insights and helping our employees get the answers to their reasonable suspicion drug testing questions. Any final thoughts before we wrap up today?
I think it was a great video to help folks understand reasonable suspicion and the importance of reasonable suspicion training. We have, as we mentioned, several ways that you can get this delivered to you, so easy to take advantage of. Please do so. For some of the larger companies with LMS systems, learning management systems, they're really excited about the custom training that we can do for them, and then they can upload it right into their own LMS system.
Yeah, make it easy for them. Really appreciate all that insights, and you've kind of spearheaded all of that. I know our employers greatly appreciate that. So thanks for joining us today. Make sure you check out nationaldrugscreening.com, www.nationaldrugscreening.com. You'll see our videos, links, blog posts, all the recent trends, things going on, as well as a lot of our trainings are going to be listed on there as well, and a way to contact us to reach out in case you do have questions. Make sure you like, and subscribe to our video channel. To get all the updates of things that are coming out. We have a lot of videos out there, ones we've released recently and more we have coming out very soon. And as always, we look forward to seeing you on the next video.